So turning to Fulton County, there are going to be 3 judicial races on your ballot. We have candidates here from all 3 of the races, so we're going to take one race at a time. The first race that is on the ballot that I'm going to talk about is the Georgia Court of Appeals. I could tell you what that court is about, but rather than telling you, I will let one of the candidate who is here, do that. Please welcome Ken Shigley. Ken, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
Tell us about the Court of Appeals, why we should care about the Court of Appeals and who sits on that court.
First, I want to thank your daddy. His daddy helped to train the Tuskegee Airmen, without whom my daddy wouldn't have made it back from World War II because they flew escort for his B-17. And he said that when those German jets came out, they were too fast, he couldn't get them. And without the Tuskegee Airmen flying escort, he wouldn't have made it home, and I wouldn't be here. So, thank you. My name is Ken Shigley. It's a funny name at the bottom of the alphabet, rhymes with Piggly Wiggly. I'm running for the Georgia Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals, as it's structured now, hears appeals from all the lower courts, Superior Court, State Court, and so forth, on everything except murder cases. They've simplified that jurisdiction a little bit in the last couple of years. So everything except murder, when it's appealed, goes first to the Court of Appeals. And then if the Supreme Court decides to hear an appeal from that, they can. It's 15 judges who sit in panels of 3, and they look at the paperwork, or now it's PDFs coming up electronically, from the trial courts to decide whether or not the lower court made a mistake. Now, I've been practicing law now for almost 41 years. I started out as an assistant DA where I grew up out in Douglas County, and was prosecuting all sorts of cases. After about a year, I figured out that about 85% of those cases were there because folks were either drunk, stoned, or stupid. Not politically correct terminology, but succinct. And the other 15% were mean or evil and needed to be locked away for enough time to protect the public. Then I left that, did small town general practice for a few years, then went to a law firm where I defended lawsuits around the state for a decade. Then the last 25 years or so, I've been representing people who are hurt, plaintiff's work. When I became state bar president in 2011, Governor Deal's office called me and wanted to put me on this Criminal Justice Reform Council. And I told the guy that called me, the last time I handled a criminal case myself, the indictment was written with a quill pen on parchment, but they wouldn't let me get out of it anyway. And that work has been of great interest in populations that see a lot of the criminal justice system. Now, my mama grew up in a mill village in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where her brothers said most of the boys went to prison and most of the girls got knocked up, and somehow grandma got them out of there when they were about 13 and sent them off somewhere else. But as I've worked over the years, I've seen a lot of people who grew up in such neighborhoods and such environments. And the Criminal Justice Reform Council has begun to bend the curve a little bit on the mass incarceration that has inequitably affected the African American community throughout the country. And the past 5 or 6 years, the numbers and the percentages being incarcerated, going to the prison system, have begun to go down. And if I go on the court, then I would volunteer to go back on that Criminal Justice Reform Council and to continue the process of chipping away at the factors that contribute to the inequitable incarceration, which takes guys out of the community, makes them unavailable for marriage and for functioning as daddies and contributing to their families. This is a serious problem. It doesn't relate directly to the function of a judge who rules on cases, but it's one of those things that a judge can volunteer to help with. I've continued since I was bar president on the Judicial Council's Technology Committee, and one of the things that we've got on our hopper right now is relates to this problem of cash bail. and that is to begin notifying people of court dates by text message. In places where it's been tried, it's much more effective than relying on these bail bondsmen. And that's something that we're beginning to work on in Georgia now. There are a lot of factors that go into these problems, and nobody by himself can solve all the problems. But if I have the opportunity to serve on the Court of Appeals, I'll first try to be very conscientious about reading all those briefs and all those transcripts and ruling on the cases based on the facts and the law. And then the hook is getting out. I'm going to give Charles the microphone. Any questions, comments, or bit of criticisms?
Well, while everybody's thinking of questions, let me just ask.
Sure, sure.
Can you give us an example of a criminal case
Okay.
in which a Court of Appeals judge has made a difference?
Let me think about that a little bit. I think let me just answer more broadly. I'm having trouble thinking of a specific example right now.
Or how can a judge make
Well, I think that being aware of the environmental factors that go into cases coming up there, and having the experience on both sides of the criminal justice process to kind of see what's happened sometimes. I remember a case that I was assigned to prosecute 40 years ago. And in a busy DA's office, sometimes you get handed a case to go prosecute this case. Go try this one next. And I walked in there, and somebody else had already struck the jury, and I took over the case in midstream and we just worked from the sheriff's department's file. And I recognized in midstream that this was a political prosecution. This defendant was a young black guy who was going to college part-time and was working on voter registration in Douglas County in the African American community, and had applied for a job in the sheriff's office. And it just began to smell bad in the middle of the trial. I did everything I could to lose it, but I couldn't. I couldn't backstroke far enough, fast enough. But when you see things that don't smell right, get your antenna up and look a little harder. Because sometimes you get a case that really shouldn't have been prosecuted. Other questions? Yeah. Questions, comments? Thank you for having me tonight.
Let me ask one.
Yeah, sure.
So we will move on.
Sure.
Just ask this. So this is a contested race.
It is a contested race.
There are two candidates in the race.
Both pale males named Ken.
The other person is also named Ken.
That's right.
If the other Ken were here and he had the opportunity to ask you a question, what would that question be? And how would you?
He might ask why I'm running when I'm already too old to get a pension.
What would your answer be?
I see it as an opportunity to give back in the last quarter of a career. The way the pension system is structured, you have to retire by 75, and it takes 10 years to vest, and you can't partially vest. So I will never get the pension. So I'm going to serve until I don't. Probably 6 to 12 years.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When that case, how'd that case go?
The jury convicted the guy. He appealed. I tried to lose the appeal. I couldn't. I tried to make the weakest case for the state I could, recognizing what had happened. This was 40 years ago. And you just couldn't lose it. And then when the remittitor came in from the Court of Appeals, I just filed it away. I hope he went on and had a good life. It was one of those really moral dilemmas. If I'd been a little bit more mature than I was at 27, I might have dismissed the case in midstream and lost my job and gone on. But at that point, I didn't feel like getting fired that week. Okay. Anybody else? It brings to mind something that's a truism for all these things, and that is that the hardest choices are never between good and bad, but between good and good, and between bad and bad. And hopefully 40 years later, I have enough maturity to make a better choice than I did that day. Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken Shigley, everybody, will be on your ballot.